What did Gamergate mean to you?
Well, Gamergate meant a few things. It was partially, and I think became more over time, about anti-censorship, creative freedom, etc., etc. But it was also about ethics in games journalism. And yeah, that's a refrain. That's a cliche at this point, but it was true at the time. The games press had, for a long time, been diametrically opposed in many ways to gaming customers, had done a number of very corrupt things. Oftentimes, bad business practices were involved, payola schemes, just general bad journalism practices, and a lot of clickbait. And these two issues, the creative freedom and anti-wokeness and general political stuff, intersected like, two trains on perpendicular tracks with the ethics in games journalism stuff, which previously had been championed by a man named Total Biscuit. Well, his online name, Total Biscuit. The guy was named John Bain. And he is no longer with us because fuck cancer. But at the time, he was one of the most prominent pro-consumer voices in gaming. He was a YouTuber who did basically game first impressions and primers for customers whether they should buy something or not. But he was also very focused on calling out the bad practices of the major print media games journalism outlets, as well as some of the large game publishers themselves. And it was through him that I became aware of a lot of the shady stuff, which much of it blew up into Gamergate due to things like games journalists reviewing games that had been made by their roommate, or giving coverage, very positive, uncritical coverage, to someone they would end up sleeping with, and not disclosing that there was a personal relationship there. It was a very incestuous sort of environment, wherein the major gaming companies often came very close to outright bribing the games journalism outlets for good scores. And many of the smaller indie game developers were traveling in the same social cliques with a lot of the games journalists. And there was a lot of one hand washing the other. And Gamergate happened when gamers became aware of one of these incidents, pointed it out, and the games press responded by trying to nuke the entire gaming hobby to protect themselves.
Sorry, I was looking up something real quick. You mentioned we're not going to mention names if you don't want to, but
I don't think that this is necessarily about specific people.
No,
I think that if it had not been those particular people, within a couple months or years, it would have been someone else.
We can cut that. We can cut that the meta talk out and just for the book itself. But
Okay.
a lot of people think about games journalism, think about what you consider wokeness and creative freedom, and they view these as like completely separate issues. Like, why would they be intersecting, as you say?
Because Well, almost all of the games journalists are themselves extremely woke. Like they are true believers of this ideology, or at least that's how they present themselves. Some of them are probably doing it for clickbait, to a point that is just well outside the mainstream Overton window of American politics. Your average person on the street, Republican or Democrat, does not think of things in nearly the same extreme identity-based lens that dominates gaming journalism, to the point that it has pushed out almost every other perspective. Like you go on Kotaku, Polygon, The Gamer, any sites like that, and you're probably not going to find one single reporter there who is not a lock, stock, and barrel believer in woke ideology, to the point that if anyone were hired at that publication who were not a true believer in woke ideology, those people would hound them out of the job. And we've seen that happen quite a few times. And the intersection of the two things is when the journalists use their journalistic position to try to push their personal politics on the hobby. There should be a difference between journalism and activism.
Push their personal politics on the hobby? Isn't that just them expressing opinions you don't like?
Well, if they were doing so like we are, just people talking, people tweeting, etc., yes. And that would be okay. They're entitled to their opinions. That's their free speech. The problem is that they do it and they present these opinions as though they are journalism. Journalism is supposed to follow certain ethical standards. It's supposed to strive for objectivity. It's supposed to try to avoid doing unnecessary harm to individuals. It's supposed to try to inform the public, not manipulate them. And they don't draw this distinction. Many of these sites have no barrier between hard reporting and op-ed. And that's activism disguising itself as journalism and trying to take advantage of the credibility that journalism has in the minds of the general public to pursue activist ends.
What does objectivity in games journalism look like to you, and why do you think that's important?
Well, objectivity looks like a site having, for example, clear standards for what does and does not ding a game's score. Like, how much do they weight a game's graphics? How much do they weight its gameplay? How much do they weight whether it is largely bug-free at launch? How much do they weight the quality of its story? Things like that. That the viewer can know and gauge and have some transparency from them, rather than these scores just being obtuse random numbers that sometimes are raised because the publisher flew the game's journalist on an all-expenses-paid trip somewhere, and sometimes are lowered because the journalist didn't like seeing a character's panties.
What if their subjective experience as a reviewer was that they had a less than positive experience because they thought an element of the game was sexist?
I think that things like that are too subjective to be factored into a game's score. Because when you're a journalist or a critic, you're not just writing your opinion. You're essentially writing to inform the customer. Major games are expensive. They're $60. Now, many of the companies are trying to ask for $70. And oftentimes, they have things like microtransactions on top of that. This is not a cheap hobby. And buying these games is a major decision for customers. For many people, that can be a sizable portion of their disposable income. And these critics and journalists are supposed to be in a role of informing people so that they can make better decisions, so that they can make the decisions that will make them happy. Which means that the journalist has to factor in that not all of the customers are going to have the same tastes as them. So if they want to talk about subjective stuff, if they want to talk about things that affect personal taste, then that's fine. If they want to include a blurb in the game review that they thought that the characters were too sexualized and the game had too much fan service, that's useful information. Some people may choose not to buy the game for that reason. But when they start dinging the score as if it were something like the game crashing on launch, that's not reasonable. These things aren't the same. If the game crashes on launch, that's not a subjective problem. That's it just not worth your money. It doesn't work. It's a broken product. Those are the kinds of things that should negatively affect scores.
We've already briefly touched upon this, but maybe some people in the gaming website's audience are turned off by sexy characters in games. Maybe that's the kind of audience they want to cultivate. Is there something wrong with that?
Well, like I said, if they want to include a blurb in the article, then go for it. But when it starts affecting things like review scores, especially in an environment where oftentimes Metacritic scores determine whether developers get a bonus from the company or not, that's not as reasonable. See, if you look on sites like Metacritic or Rotten Tomatoes, they don't have one aggregate score. They have two. They have a critic score and an audience score. The score that matters, that determines things like whether a movie is rated fresh or not, or oftentimes whether developers get a bonus from their publisher at Christmas or not, is the critic score. It's placed on a pedestal above the audience score. It's seen as more credible, more professional, more objective. It's the score given by trained professional journalists who know how to review something and how to look at it from that technical perspective in a way that the average audience member doesn't. If it were all one score, I probably wouldn't care that much about things like what factors into a critic's score. But the fact that they are given this extra platform, this extra pedestal, where their scores are apart from everyone else's, confers on them an extra duty to objectivity. As they say, with great power comes great responsibility.
Do you think it's a good thing if reviewers take the financial circumstances of developers into account when reviewing a game?
In the sense that should they artificially go easy on the game because they don't want to be responsible for costing someone their livelihood?
Sure.
No, I don't think so. I think that their primary duty is to the customer and to accurately informing the customer. But in the sense that they should have goalposts for their score which are, to what degree is possible, objective and not just based on personal taste, yes, I think that they should factor in that responsibility.
If they review a game and their honest opinion is, I don't like this game, does it really matter why they came to that conclusion? As long as they write down the reasons.
Yes, I think it does. Because, like I said, when they're professional journalists, it's about more than whether they personally liked it. A friend of mine has a good analogy for this. She calls it the werewolf cookbook problem, wherein somebody orders a cookbook off of Amazon and then they leave a negative review because they wanted a book about werewolves. This is a cookbook. There are no werewolves in it, 1 star. It's entirely valid that their personal taste is towards werewolf fiction. But blaming a cookbook for not being a werewolf story isn't really reasonable. And if you're a professional journalist, it's really unprofessional and possibly even unethical to behave like that. You should be trying to inform people, not just vent about your personal feelings towards the game.
Is there room in the games journalism industry for different types of reviews? Room enough for both what you consider objective reviews and also for those that base their critiques on their personal preferences or political philosophy?
Yes, but I think that in traditional news, that kind of thing would essentially be the difference between the reporting sections of a newspaper and the op-ed section. And I think that if those kinds of opinion pieces were more clearly marked as op-ed rather than a review score that goes in the critic score and affects things like bonuses, tomato meter, stuff like that, it would be more reasonable. And that's not entirely on the journalists. It's also on sites like Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes to better curate what they allow to be considered part of the critic score. But I think that the end result is a problem where too much bias is leaking into media scoring.
Why aren't reviews more equivalent to an op-ed?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. It just seems to be how the industry developed. When these scoring metrics started becoming a thing, which I guess was all the way back when there were actual print games journalism magazines that you got sent every month. They started taking on less of the role of an opinion piece and more an objective rating system. And I think they have to try to live up to that veneer of objectivity that came into it with the scoring system.
If video games are a work of art, aren't these, as you call them, subjective critiques, good? Isn't that how other works of art are treated?
Well, I've never gone to an art gallery and seen 5 stars under a painting.
Oh,
People,
good.
movies, yes, but movies have the same problem. I think that there's this intermixing of essentially art critique with buyer's guides when the two don't really fill the same role.
It sounds like the main issue you have is the fact that they're putting ratings on these. Is that right?
In large part. And I think that in many cases, this results in activists using journalistic platforms to essentially try to weaponize their audiences as a means of bullying companies into giving them what they want politically. Wherein I think they will go so far as to misinform the buying public and deliberately try to bias them one way or another towards whether they purchase a game, to use that as a reward punishment system to get the developers to change content and give them their way politically. Essentially, it's saying to the developers, if you make media that is woke and that caters to our politics, we will be your strongest soldiers. We will run cover for you. We will hype up your product. We will minimize any discussion of its flaws. We'll even go so far as to vilify your critics. But if you don't cater to our politics, we will investigate you looking for problems to make scandals out of. We will talk up every slight flaw in your game like it's a huge game-breaking problem. We will try to find ways to smear your corporate culture or developers who work at your company with various sorts of accusations. We will generally make your lives difficult until you give us your way. To give a good example, there is a games journalist named Jason Schreier. And when he wants to be, this man is a stunningly skilled investigative reporter. But he is also incredibly politically biased. And that influences how he covers stories that are presented as hard news. For example, he covered instances of crunch, that is, games developers overworking their employees, at 2 different companies, Naughty Dog and CD Projekt Red. Now, Naughty Dog is a very woke games studio, or at least has become so in recent years under the leadership of Neil Druckmann. And when he wrote about the crunch conditions at Naughty Dog, he was fairly forgiving, even-handed, covered the story in a reasonably objective and non-sensational manner. On the other hand, there's CD Projekt Red, which is not that woke a game studio, or at least wasn't at the time. They make games that are full of blood and boobs and sexy women and so forth. And consequently, they're a big target to a lot of these woke games journalists. And when crunch was uncovered going on their Cyberpunk 2077 game, Schreier covered it with article after article after article, vilifying the practice and vilifying the studio in the strongest possible term. And that's just a double standard, and pretty clearly one that he's applying through his journalistic position on the basis of the studio's politics. And it's that kind of unfairness that's such a problem. It's essentially them making trouble for these companies and trying to make consumers mad at them until the companies cave and give the journalists their way politically. In many ways, it resembles the behavior of a protection racket.